Working the night shift at an old small-town museum had always been a strange and solitary experience. The hallways were lined with dusty exhibits, their silhouettes casting long, unsettling shadows. On most nights, the silence of the museum was broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden floors and the distant hum of a malfunctioning air conditioning system. But one night, as I soon discovered, held something far more sinister beneath its seemingly mundane surface. I had been the night security guard at the Hamilton Historical Museum for years, tasked with keeping watch over the priceless artifacts and ensuring the security of the building. It wasn't a glamorous job, but it paid the bills, and the quiet nights allowed me time to work on my novel. One particular evening, as I settled into the monotonous routine of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The usual stillness of the museum felt different. I checked the locks on the main entrance, but they were secure. I dismissed the feeling as mere paranoia, a side effect of the solitude of the night. As I made my rounds through the museum, my flashlight beam danced over the glass display cases, revealing a treasure trove of antiques and relics. Ancient weapons, old photographs, and delicate porcelain figurines seemed to watch me as I passed. I couldn't help but feel that the artifacts held stories of their own, secrets that the passage of time had failed to erase. One exhibit in particular drew my attention. It was a display of Victorian-era dolls, their porcelain faces frozen in a lifelike expression. The dolls had always unnerved me, and I never lingered near them for long. However, on this night I noticed something unusual. One of the dolls had shifted position, its porcelain head now turned to face me. I approached the display, my heart pounding. I had been the only person in the museum all night, and I was certain I had locked up securely. But there it was, the doll, its tiny, lifeless eyes seemingly following my every move. I reached out to examine the doll, my fingers trembling. As my hand brushed against the cold porcelain, I noticed a faint scratching sound coming from within the exhibit. I swung my flashlight around, but there was nothing to explain the noise. My unease grew as I continued my rounds, the sensation of being watched lingering at the edge of my consciousness. The more I investigated, the more unsettling discoveries I made. In the natural history section, the stuffed animals seemed to have shifted position, their glassy eyes appearing more animated than usual. I dismissed it as a trick of the light and a result of my imagination. However, the creeping feeling of being watched never left me. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. The museum, once a place of quiet solace, had become a source of unrelenting paranoia. The night wore on and I returned to my desk in the security office to catch up on some writing. I had always been an aspiring novelist, and the quiet nights at the museum provided the perfect backdrop for inspiration. But that night the words eluded me. I couldn't focus, my attention continually drawn to the ambiance of the museum. At around 2 a.m., as I sat staring at a blank page, the museum's old grandfather clock chimed loudly from the adjacent hallway. The sudden, unexpected sound startled me. I got up and approached the clock, wondering how it could have possibly chimed on its own. It was a mechanical clock, not connected to any electrical system. As I examined the clock's intricate gears, the scratching sound from earlier returned. It was now louder, more insistent. I followed the noise down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The source of the scratching was coming from a small, nondescript door that led to the basement. The door, typically locked at night, was now slightly ajar. I couldn't explain how the door had come open, but my sense of unease deepened. With cautious trepidation, I pushed the door open and descended the creaky stairs into the dark basement. The overhead light was dim, casting long, mystic shadows on the walls. The scratching sound grew louder as I descended further into the basement. It was coming from behind an old, dusty curtain that separated a storage area from the rest of the basement. I approached the curtain and cautiously pulled it aside. What I saw made me grasp for air. Huddled in a corner was a homeless man, his eyes wide with fear, his clothes tattered and filthy. He clutched a small, worn-out notebook and scribbled furiously in it with a shaky hand. The room smelled of decay and desperation. I took a step back, my mind racing with questions. How had he entered the basement, and why was he here in the museum at this hour? The homeless man appeared to be incoherent, muttering to himself as he continued to write in his notebook. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man's head snapped up and his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood turn cold. "They're coming," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're always coming, and I have to document it. You mustn't let them in." I couldn't make sense of his words, and the feeling of unease deepened. I took a step closer, trying to offer help, but the man recoiled, his eyes filled with terror. "They're watching," he said, his voice growing louder. "You can't trust anyone, not even yourself." Before I could respond, he bolted from the corner and disappeared into the darkness of the basement. I called out to him, but he was gone, leaving behind his notebook, open on the ground. Curiosity got the better of me, and I picked up the notebook, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with rambling, cryptic notes, sketches of strange symbols, and frantic scribbles about being watched and the need to document everything. It was a chaotic, nightmarish diary of someone who had lost touch with reality. I had a million questions, but no answers. Who was this man? And what had brought him to the museum? What had he meant by, "they're coming"? As the night dragged on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The homeless man's ominous warning echoed in my mind, and I couldn't help but wonder if there was more to the museum than met the eye. The sense of unease had escalated into a full-blown paranoia. Around 3 a.m., I made my way back to the security office, intending to call the authorities about the intruder. But the moment I picked up the phone, a chilling sound filled the room. A soft, melodic hum that seemed to emanate from the museum itself. I turned to look out into the hallway, and there, standing in the dim light, was a group of people. They were dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks. They moved silently, in perfect unison, as if they were part of some ritual. My heart raced as I watched the bizarre spectacle unfold. The group of masked figures moved in a circular formation, their movements fluid and graceful. It was a surreal, otherworldly performance. I couldn't explain what I was witnessing, and I couldn't tear my eyes away from the haunting scene. The humming sound grew louder, filling the air with a hypnotic melody. And then, with a sudden jerky movement, the group of figures raised their arms in unison and pointed toward me. The sight sent a jolt of terror through my body, and I stumbled back, my pulse racing. I dropped the phone and fumbled for the door to the security office, desperate to escape the nightmarish scene. But the door was stuck and I couldn't get it open. The humming sound grew louder and the masked figures continued to point in my direction. I was trapped, surrounded by the enigmatic performance. The sense of dread deepened as I realized that the homeless man's warning had come true. I was being watched, and I had no way to escape. As the figures closed in, their masks devoid of expression, I couldn't help but wonder what their intentions were and what secrets the museum held. The night shift had taken a surreal, nightmarish turn, and I was left with an overwhelming sense of dread, my every instinct screaming at me to run, to escape the bizarre, sinister spectacle unfolding before my eyes. But the figures advanced, their hands reaching out, and the world around me began to warp and distort. It was as if reality itself had become unhinged, and I was trapped in a waking nightmare, a place where the boundaries between the mundane and the inexplicable had blurred and twisted. And as the figures closed in, their masks a chilling mask of indifference, I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever escape the enigmatic grip of the night shift, if I would ever uncover the truth behind the museum's eerie and unsettling mysteries. Story 2. Working the night shift in a small research facility was always a creepy experience. The building was situated on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense forest and far from the comforting glow of the city lights. As a laboratory assistant, I had grown used to the solitude of the night, but one particular night would forever change the way I viewed the facility. My shift began like any other. The research facility specialized in studying rare plants and their potential medicinal properties. Most nights, the silence was broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning system and the distant chirping of crickets. But that night was different. As I made my rounds, checking on the various experiments, I noticed something odd. In one of the isolated containment chambers, a peculiar plant had grown much larger than it should have. It was a rare species known as luminaris, with phosphorescent leaves that emitted a soft, eerie glow. But this plant had exceeded its normal size and now filled the chamber. I approached the containment chamber, my curiosity piqued. The soft green glow of the luminaris leaves cast a surreal, almost otherworldly light on the surroundings. I reached out to touch the leaves, but before my fingers could make contact, a voice behind me said, "Don't touch it." Startled, I spun around to see Dr. Eleanor Weber, the head researcher. She was known for her reclusive nature and rarely ventured into the facility during the night. Her face was pale, and her eyes held a mixture of fear and fascination. "What's going on, Dr. Weber?" I asked, bewildered by the strange occurrence. "Why has this plant grown so large?" She didn't answer immediately, her eyes fixed on the luminaris. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It's not just the size, it's the rate of growth. I've never seen anything like it." We both watched in silence as the luminaris continued to expand, its leaves pulsating within strange light. Dr. Weber's fear was palpable, and I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. As we left the containment chamber, she explained that the luminaris had been a subject of intense research for years. Its unique properties made it a potential game-changer in the pharmaceutical industry, but its cultivation was notoriously difficult, with growth rates measured in millimeters over months, not inches and hours. Dr. Weber believed that something extraordinary had occurred, something beyond our comprehension. She was determined to find answers, and as the night progressed, we delved deeper into the anomaly. Our investigation led us to the main research lab where the luminaris seeds were stored. To our shock, the seeds had begun to germinate, their tiny shoots pushing through the soil. It was as if an invisible force was propelling their growth. Dr. Weber took a sample of the anomalous plant, and we returned to her office to examine it under the microscope. What we discovered was beyond belief. The plant cells showed signs of accelerated growth, as if they had been subjected to some unknown force. As the night wore on, we became increasingly absorbed in our research, forgetting about the time. The luminaris anomaly was unlike anything we had ever seen, and it held a dark, magnetic allure. At around 3 a.m., while we were engrossed in our research, a low, guttural sound echoed through the facility. Dr. Weber and I exchanged worried glances. The sound was unnatural, a discordant blend of whispers and growls. We decided to investigate, following the sound to its source. It led us to a remote section of the facility that housed the staff quarters. As we approached, the strange noises grew louder and more unsettling. It was as if the building itself was alive with a sinister presence. Inside one of the quarters, we discovered a horrifying scene. The room had been torn apart, furniture scattered, and the walls were covered in strange symbols. At the center of the room was the facility's janitor, Mr. Ramirez. He was huddled in a corner, his eyes vacant, and he muttered incoherently. Dr. Weber tried to speak to him, to understand what had happened, but Mr. Ramirez's words were a nonsensical jumble. He kept repeating the word growth over and over. We called for security and Mr. Ramirez was escorted from the facility. But the sense of dread remained. The mysterious anomaly of the luminaris and the strange events of the night had left us all deeply unnerved. We returned to the main lab, determined to find answers. As we examined the luminaris sample, Dr. Weber made a chilling discovery. The plant cells were mutating, merging with other organisms in ways that defied the laws of nature. The more we delved into the research, the more we realized that we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding. Dr. Weber's fascination had given way to fear, and I couldn't help but feel that we had stumbled upon something malevolent. We worked through the night, our research becoming increasingly frantic as the luminaris continued to grow and mutate. Those sounds that had plagued us earlier had returned, filling the facility with a sense of foreboding. At around 4 a.m., as we reached a breakthrough in our research, a blinding flash of light filled the lab. We shielded our eyes, stumbling back in shock. When the light subsided, we were met with an astonishing sight. The luminaris had grown to an enormous size, its leaves stretching out like dark, outstretched hands. It pulsed within green light, filling the lab with an otherworldly glow. Dr. Weber and I exchanged horrified glances. The luminaris had become a monstrous, mutated entity, its presence dominating the room. It was as if it had absorbed the very essence of the facility. We tried to retreat to escape the nightmarish scene, but the door to the lab had become sealed shut. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped with the abomination. The luminaris leaves seemed to reach out, as if they had a mind of their own. We fought to break free, our desperate struggles doing little against the overwhelming power of the Luminaris. The plant seemed to pulse with malevolence, its unnatural growth spiraling out of control. As the Luminaris closed in, the facility itself seemed to come alive, the walls shifting and contorting as if they were part of some grotesque living organism. The guttural sounds grew louder, filling the air with a cacophony of whispers and growls. Dr. Weber and I clung to each other, our fear mounting as the monstrous plant closed in. It was as if we had become part of a grotesque experiment, one that defied all logic and reason. The Luminaris leaves enveloped us, their scary light casting us into a surreal, nightmarish world. It was a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare had blurred, a place where the laws of nature were bent and twisted. And as the Luminaris consumed us, I couldn't help but wonder if the plant had become a doorway to a world beyond our comprehension, a world of darkness and malevolence. It was a world that had claimed us, a world that we would never escape. The night shift had become a night of horror, a night that would forever haunt my dreams. Story 3. The night shift was always my least favorite part of the job. The empty hallways of St. Martin's retirement home seemed to echo with the ghostly memories of its inhabitants. The corridors played tricks on my tired eyes, and the creaks and groans of the old building were unnerving. But it was a paycheck and I had bills to pay. As the new night nurse on duty, I was responsible for the well-being of the elderly residents during the darkest hours. Most of them slept through the night, but a few would occasionally need my assistance. The isolation of the night shift only heightened my unease. It was as if the building itself was haunted by the shadows of the past. The first few weeks were relatively uneventful, except for the occasional patient needing assistance to the bathroom or a glass of water. But as the nights passed, I began to notice peculiar things. The residents, particularly the ones with dementia, would sometimes speak in hushed tones to no one in particular. They claimed to see figures standing at the foot of their beds or hear distant whispers. I tried to reassure them, chalking it up to their old age and fragile mental states. But deep down, their stories sent a cold feeling down my spine. And then there was Mrs. Henderson. Mrs. Henderson was an elderly woman who lived in room 212. She was sharp for her age, a former librarian who still possessed a wealth of knowledge. But as the weeks went by, I noticed she became increasingly agitated during my shifts. One night as I entered her room to check on her, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength. Her eyes were wide with fear as she whispered, "They're watching. Don't you see them, dear? They're always there." I followed her gaze, but there was nothing to see. The room was empty, save for the soft glow of the nightlight. I tried to soothe her, telling her it was just her imagination. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. As days turned into weeks, I noticed a pattern. The residents' restlessness seemed to increase with each passing night. They would talk of shadowy figures, distant voices, and faces in the windows. I began to doubt my own sanity, wondering if the isolation and dark atmosphere of the retirement home were playing tricks on my mind. One night, as I made my rounds, I heard a faint sound coming from the basement. It was a soft, melodic hum that made my blood freeze. I decided to investigate, my curiosity getting the best of me. I descended the creaky stairs, and as I reached the bottom, the humming grew louder. The basement was a labyrinthine maze of storage rooms and long-forgotten furniture. The source of the humming seemed to be coming from one of the rooms at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and a pale, eerie light seeped through the crack. As I pushed the door open, I was met with a scene that froze me in my tracks. In the center of the room, a group of elderly residents sat in a circle, their faces twisted with a strange mix of fear and ecstasy. They were chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend, their voices rising and falling in an unsettling rhythm. In the center of the circle was Mrs. Henderson, her eyes rolled back in her head, her frail body swaying to the haunting melody. My heart raced as I watched the bizarre spectacle unfold before me. I had no idea what I was witnessing, but it felt like something out of a nightmare. I couldn't move, couldn't speak as the chanting continued. It was as if time had stopped, and I was trapped in this surreal, otherworldly moment. I finally mustered the courage to step back and quietly close the door, retreating to the safety of the narrow corridor. My mind raced with questions and fear. What were they doing? What was the purpose of that strange ritual? I decided to consult my supervisor in the morning, hoping for an explanation. The morning couldn't come soon enough. I rushed to my supervisor's office, my heart pounding with anxiety. I explained what I had witnessed in the basement, expecting shock and disbelief. But to my surprise, my supervisor's face remained unnervingly calm. "That's nothing to worry about," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Sometimes they just do strange things at night. It's part of their condition." I tried to protest to convey the urgency of the situation, but he brushed it off as the ramblings of confused elderly residents. I couldn't help but feel as though there was more to the story than he was letting on. That night, I couldn't get the image of the basement ritual out of my mind. I felt a growing sense of unease, a gnawing fear that there was something sinister lurking in the shadows of St. Martin's retirement home. As I made my rounds that evening, I couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The residents seemed more restless than ever, their eyes darting around as if they were constantly on edge. It was as if the retirement home had become a pressure cooker ready to burst at any moment. And then it happened. As I entered Mrs. Henderson's room, I found her lying in bed, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed a trembling finger towards the window, her voice barely more than a whisper. "They're here," she said, her voice quivering. "The watchers in the night. They're waiting for you." I turned to look out the window, half expecting to see some malevolent presence lurking in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the same empty courtyard and the distant glow of streetlights. I tried to calm Mrs. Henderson, but her fear was palpable. She clutched my arm and begged me not to leave her alone. I decided to stay with her, hoping to provide some comfort in the face of her overwhelming terror. As the night wore on, Mrs. Henderson's fear only intensified. She spoke of the watchers in the night, of the things they had seen and the terrible secrets they held. It was a chilling narrative that creeped me out. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and dimmed, casting mysterious shadows on the walls. Mrs. Henderson's grip on my arm tightened, and she gasped in terror. I turned to look at the window, and that's when I saw them. Figures, dark and indistinct, stood outside the window. They were tall and featureless, their outlines shifting and swaying in the night breeze. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were locked onto them, her face a mask of pure horror. I tried to pull the curtains shut to block out the nightmarish figures, but they seemed to flicker in and out of existence, as if they were ethereal and insubstantial. I was overcome with a sense of dread, a feeling that we were being watched by something vicious and beyond our understanding. Mrs. Henderson's frail voice broke the silence, her words laced with terror. "They're the watchers in the night. They've been waiting for you, waiting for your turn." I couldn't bear to look at those shadowy figures any longer. I grabbed Mrs. Henderson, her trembling body in my arms, and rushed out of the room. As I made my way down the hallway, I noticed that the other residents were also in a state of fear and agitation. They spoke of the watchers in the night, of their long-awaited arrival. The retirement home had descended into chaos. Residents roamed the corridors in a daze, their voices filled with terror and confusion. It was as if a sinister force had descended upon the building, and there was no escape from its grasp. I desperately tried to call for help, but the phone lines were dead, and the lights continued to flicker, casting weird, dancing shadows on the walls. The building seemed to groan and creak, as if it were a living, breathing entity. As I led Mrs. Henderson down the stairwell, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being pursued. The air was thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and the dark figures seemed to be closing in on us. Finally, we reached the ground floor, but the entrance seemed impossibly far away. The retirement home had become a nightmarish labyrinth, and we were trapped in its web of fear and uncertainty. Just as we reached the entrance, I heard a soft, melodic hum, the same creepy tune that I had heard in the basement. I turned to look behind us, and the figures were there, their shadowy forms looming in the darkness. They were closing in, their presence suffocating and malicious. I pushed the heavy double doors open, the night air rushing in to greet us. As I stepped out into the courtyard, I felt a strange sensation, as if the ground beneath me was shifting and undulating. I turned to look back at the retirement home, and what I saw will haunt me for the rest of my days. The building seemed to contort and twist, its windows transforming into gaping, hollow eyes that stared out at me with an otherworldly malevolence. The retirement home had become a nightmarish entity, a living, breathing abomination that defied all reason and logic. Mrs. Henderson's voice broke through my shock, her trembling words a haunting lament. "They've been waiting for you, waiting for your turn." I turned and fled into the night, leaving the retirement home and its horrors behind. The night air was cold and unforgiving, and the darkness seemed to stretch on into eternity. As I stumbled through the streets, I couldn't help but wonder what had become of the residents and the sinister figures that had pursued us. I was haunted by the memory of the retirement home, a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare had blurred and twisted. The night shift had turned into a night of terror, a night that would forever haunt my dreams. The retirement home and its dark secrets were now a part of me, an unending nightmare that I could never escape. And as I walked through the cold, unforgiving darkness, I couldn't help but wonder if the retirement home was still there, waiting for its next victim, waiting for my turn to come.